As Eve said to Adam, this is a time of transition. And indeed it is. The coming wave of thinking about ultimate reality is transreligious. The reason can be stated in a syllogism. If the aim of theology is to know and articulate all we can about the ultimate reality and our relation to it, and if revelations, enlightenments, and insights into that reality are to be found in more than one religious tradition, then what we need is not merely confessional theology, but theology without confessional restrictions, theology without walls. It's a question of subject matter. Theology is not about our own tradition. It's about the logos of theos, using the latter term broadly, the articulate understanding of ultimate reality, and how best to live our lives in light of that reality. The volume, Theology Without Walls, the Transreligious Imperative, contains chapters by 22 contributors. The aim of the following brief presentations is just to provide a glimpse of the range, diversity, and interest of the contributions. And so I turn first to Robert Neville, whose piece is entitled Ideas and Programs for Theology Without Walls.
Thank you very much, and welcome to all of you. My basic advice is to start as young as you can and work until you can no longer make much sense. This, of course, means different things for different people. Theology Without Walls, for me, is systematic. And I started my system early, during kindergarten. A classmate asked me whether God was a person. And I collaborated with my dad on the answer. Although Jesus was a person, God was more like light or electricity. That sounded reasonable to me at age 5. And I developed the view with greater sophistication in college with the senior thesis, and then in graduate school with a dissertation that was revised and published as God the Creator. I've developed that idea from many angles, and most recently with my 30th book, Metaphysics of Goodness. That idea has been related to just about everything, and thus is a kind of system. Theology Without Walls is also comparative. I was trained in a wide history of philosophy, but only Western philosophy. I've worked out a system of comparison whereby I take a comparative category and make it vague with respect to all things it might compare, and then make the comparisons. What is interesting is how the category changes and expands as it is made more specific. Of course, the ideas used to explicate one category also give rise to more categories, so that slowly I developed a large historical system of interpretation. That process is never finished. Theologians Without Walls are usually teachers in high schools and colleges, and perhaps graduate schools. I think it is helpful to teach introductory courses, and also, where appropriate, much more sophisticated courses, over and over. The repetition is not the same each time, but gets better, or at least different. Teaching at many levels has the advantage of getting you to explain yourself more thoroughly. Theology Without Walls also needs to seek out professional associations that are relevant for what they are doing. These are always adventitious, but I have found that the International Society for Chinese Philosophy, as well as the Metaphysical Society, have offered me both a stage for my work and also consolation at the fact that most people in the theological profession are not systematic and comparative. Theology Without Walls also benefits from publication. Start early and continue until you can no longer publish. Look back on your early work as just early work. Keep your eye on the system and think about the next wrinkle of sophistication. Remember that any theology that is explicitly walled in by confessionalism in the larger arena is just sociology, not theology. Sociology is about what some group thinks. Theology aims to be true. Thank you.
Revisiting Bella's Sheila in a religiously pluralist century. Come on.
Once upon a time, before entering graduate study, I was an amateur. I hadn't been trained yet in theology. I thought as a child and I spoke as a child, and earning 2 graduate degrees beat that right out of me. My contribution to the volume centers upon a young woman named Sheila Larson, whom sociologist Robert Bella introduced to the readers of his 1985 book, Habits of the Heart. The pseudonymous Sheila informed Bella that her spiritual approach in life was Sheilaism, in which she was guided by her own internal sense that human beings are simply to care for one another. No Bible, no church attendance, no creeds. This rank individualism disturbed Bella, and it disturbed me as a graduate student reading Bella for the first time. My task in pursuing a doctorate in theology was to develop and to articulate a Roman Catholic tradition that was governed by normative texts, doctrines, rituals, and hierarchical authority. Sheilas of all types, those who either hadn't been theologically trained or who rejected authoritative religious traditions, moved in a different cosmos, a chaotic, deep darkness without form, in which only the spirit of modern consumerism moved over the waters. Okay, individualist boomers, I thought, you all stick to your lane and I will stick to mine. To be fair, in graduate school I also read the work of Wade Clark Roof and others who provided a more optimistic appraisal of the religious individualism that has only become more ubiquitous in American life during recent decades. I read these works in the sociology of religion, however, merely on the descriptive level, as presenting aspiring theologians with the lay of the land that we would have to navigate. The idea that Sheila Larson could have something constructive to contribute to theological traditions was not an idea that I entertained at the time. My experience as professor and a teacher, however, forced me to re-examine my easy dismissal of secularization and religious disaffiliation as potential resources for constructive theology. Early encounters in the classroom showed me that, based on their own versions of Sheilaism, students had little interest in the various typologies that scholars in the theology of religion had carved out to explain the relationships between different religious traditions. No matter how carefully delineated or how thoughtful thinkers like Paul Knitter, Alan Race, or Gavin DaCosta were in assessing the possibilities afforded to religious traditions in an age of pluralism, I found myself in classrooms full of Sheilas. Labeling the students as religiously illiterate and in need of civically responsible indoctrination would have been counterproductive. My students taught me that individual agency should not be considered as absurd in the theology of religions, but as a historically serious response in an age of religious pluralism, deserving the same degree of scholarly attention as the pioneers in the theology of religion gave to other religious worldviews. AAR veterans will recall that the figure of Ninian Smart, formerly the president of this academy, once graced the corridors of our annual meeting. Smart's later work was important as an attempt to extend the methodology used in the study of classic religious traditions to new religious movements. Yet even Smart's work in one of his later works like Dimensions of the Sacred, however, still posited the existence of cross-cultural categories as a bridge between religious and emerging secular worldviews. But what to do when individual human agency emerges from underneath these categories and confronts scholars with its raw, untrammeled incommensurability? My chapter in Theology Without Walls has chosen to embrace Sheilaism, not by ratifying all of the contradictory choices we make, but by accepting that the individualism that worried Bella and that worried me is not going away. And so it should be incorporated into a dialogical study of theology. After all, historical study of religion informs us that classic religious traditions, far from being reified vehicles of transcendent communication, impervious to the choices that adherents make, are the products of centuries and millennia of forks taken in spiritual roads. In the shifting landscape of 20th century spirituality, Sheila Larson was easily exposed because her religious choices did not have the benefit of being sanctioned by tradition, which has a way of concealing the choices those who identify as Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, or Jews make. A critical examination of history, epistemology, and theology will show, however, that both the traditionalists and the individualists pursue what they take to be ultimate ends. In that sense, we are all Sheilas.
Yeah. Kurt Richardson. Kurt Anders Richardson, Theology Without Walls as Open Field Theology.
Everything I'm doing these days builds on a long career of dialogical theology, and specifically theology that is dialogical, so that the constructive intellection that serious theologians must exercise both critically and also just in learning mode, adopting new paradigms or at least analyzing them. And so in '95, I helped form with Daniel Hardy and David Ford and Peter O. to comparative theology. And that was where that group came from. And that's sort of my home in the AAR. And Frank has a particular way of conceiving of it. Not everyone is going to do a kind of confessional Routledge and then do it. They may do it in lots of different ways. Then this has been, Jerry Martin had a vision for this, and it really, Theology Without Walls. And I was very interested in how can we convert or mirror the critical implications of theology without walls with a constructive, even rather highly positive one. So OFT is what I came up with, open field theology. And also that it isn't only maybe a very deconstructive project, a very naturalizing project. All kinds of approaches are visible in TWW. But there can also be a confessional, oddly enough, a confessional theology advantage to being in TWW. In post-Constantinian Christianity, there is, and global theology, there is a profound need for an open space with as few conditions as possible. And one of the metaphors that scriptural reasoning adopted was the tent. So, and there are a lot of things there. We're not talking about a circus tent, but a nomadic tent. And yet, when you study nomadism, profoundly complex societies exist in nomadically. So it's also extremely important in a day of profoundly limitless neo-traditionalism, and also, I have to say, political ambitions. It is extremely important that the constructive task, rather than whatever this is, these kinds of political theological agendas might be. I'm very much for political theology. So I suggest anyway that confessional theologians expose themselves in a place where actually religious others want to be exposed if there is mutual understanding, and work out some of the problems of orthodoxy right in the open field. And so that was my burden, and also look forward to seeing some of you tomorrow.
Non-phenomenal, Theology Without Walls as the quest for interreligious wisdom.
I'm a little bit surprised at the elegantly crafted opening remarks by my colleagues. I thought, Jerry said 3 minutes of remarks. I'll just wing that. But let's see if I can be at least cogent, if not as elegant as my colleagues. The question that I wanted to think about in some way, and it may be only something that became clear to me after I had written this chapter, is the question of what gains one has as a confessional theologian that one might lose if one leaves the walls, whatever we might mean by the metaphor of walls. I gave a brief rumination about the notion of walls yesterday, and it turns out it's a much trickier concept to think about than one might imagine. But within the domestic frame of a tradition, one doesn't just have a number of theological claims, but theological aims, as Marcus pointed out with this notion of multiple ends. And not only does one have claims and aims, but means to attain those aims. And traditions, at least when they're working well, are about the business of forming persons and communities such that those aims are accomplished. So that, as I put it, the interpretive schemes that might be available in a particular tradition are installed in communal and personal bodies by means of therapeutic regimes that seek to install certain ways of seeing the world into embodiment, what Bob calls comportment. Right? So there's a fear to be named, namely that if one leaves the thick communities in which persons are formed, such that first-order knowledge of ultimate reality is gained by means of practices, then theology without walls might prove to be a thin project in which persons are actually not formed for wisdom. My argument in this chapter is to say there's one way to work around that problem. At least some of us ought to be engaged in multiple religious participation. We actually ought to not merely study comparatively the claims of tradition, but if we're drawn to the aims of particular traditions, also take up the means commended by particular traditions for actualizing those aims. And that multiple religious participation is a feature of contemporary life, and for many of us, there isn't a singular home of belonging to begin with, as Frank puts it. So if we do comparative theology, at least some of us, not all of us will be drawn to this project, as an exercise in seeking first-order religious wisdom by actually taking up the practices of other religious traditions, then we needn't be as afraid of losing the thickness, the practices of comportment made available by any particular home tradition. In fact, there's real gains to be had by arriving at what I call interreligious wisdom, seeing the ultimate reality of the world through more than one perspective. And not only knowing that in theory by just the study of those claims, but having those modes of knowing installed in actual bodies. So that's what my chapter commends. Not for all of us, but at least for some of us.
Wesley, love and desire, human and divine. I should have said Wesley Wildman first. There's a protocol here. No, you can come. That's good. But the title, Love and Desire, Human and Divine, a Transreligious Naturalist Account.
There's a beautiful ancient poem about love and desire. When I look at the night sky, the moon and the stars, the handiwork of thy fingers, what are human beings that you're mindful of? Mere mortals that you would care for them. Somehow those ancient Israelites had a way of looking out at the night sky and seeing intimacy, seeing desire, seeing love, rip into the very root of nature. Stunning vision of things. Totally delusional with regard to the actual cosmos. What we know from cosmology and physics is that the universe is incredibly hostile to life in almost everywhere. Not love and desire everywhere, as you might think, but very rare, in very special places, in very special pockets of life. So, if you wanted to understand the wonder of the universe, the depth of our experience, you might not look to the sky, but look inside human beings to understand love and desire. To avoid the projective aspects of that, where you wind up attributing to something characteristics that properly only belong to human beings. Now, what might help you do that? I think what I just did was deploy the sciences, a way of thinking about the world that gives you access to it in a way that's more public than is the case normally for human discourse. We don't have to be in the same club, we don't have to be in the same religion, we don't have to agree about gods. We can all have the same conversation because we've simplified the method and we simplified the object of study to the point that we can reach consensus. This, I think, is a very intriguing method for stabilising the objects of study that you might want to think about theologically. So when it comes to love and desire, my interest is in thinking about those things scientifically so as to create common ground across religious traditions where these topics are treated enormously differently. We can all agree on the science of love and desire. And in doing that, we open up the possibility of a different kind of discourse, a discourse that will go deep into the human condition, that can evoke the depth structures, the axiological character of our lives, of the world, and thus, in this place, of the universe. That's an indication of one way of doing theology without walls. It solves the problem of categories that don't work across cultural divides by creating a simplified discourse that enables us to stabilise the language that we use, to stabilise the categories that we use. However, in doing that, if you want to follow all the way through, you're going to be committed to a simplified metaphysics also. It won't be possible to assert that there are supernatural divine beings because everyone's going to disagree over them. So to finish that thought, you're going to wind up having a naturalistic metaphysics, a metaphysics that rejects invisible beings. So put together a method for stabilising categories and a simplified metaphysics for creating consensus around axiological depths and flows of nature. And you wind up with an opening to theology without walls that's actually genuinely revolutionary. So in this paper, in this chapter, what I'm trying to do is to say what that looks like by giving an example with an in-depth analysis of desire and love in human life. I would like to close with a couple of words about Jerry. I don't know whether it would have been possible for us to get to this point of having a nice shiny volume and the other collections that came before it if it weren't for Jerry's catalysing and personal power. His imagination is amazing. He's also very shrewd. You'll note that he's a classic humanist and opposed to truncated language, so he'd rather say theology without walls than TWW. And in order to phrase, whose acronym has exactly the same number of syllables as the phrase itself, so nothing is gained in terms of energy or time by using the acronym. He's just that kind of guy. Very, very careful, thinks ahead, great planner. And anyway, we're greatly in his debt, and it's very difficult to estimate exactly how many future generations are also going to be in Jerry's debt, but for sure we are. Thank you.
That was very kind of you, Wesley, and I now feel I don't need to ever have a funeral because we've had the eulogy. So, life is complete. Linda Mercanti, Theology Without Walls is a theology for SBNRs possible.
Thank you. And I agree with everything you said about Jerry. Thank you very much, Jerry. Recently I did extensive research into the beliefs of people who self-label spiritual but not religious, and it resulted in my book, Belief Without Borders, Inside the Minds of the Spiritual but Not Religious, published by Oxford University Press. Well, when Jared Martin asked me to go further and try to organize these insights into an actual theology for SBNRs, first I thought he was crazy, then I balked, and in my mind I'm going, no, really? And then I came up with the reasons why this is difficult, if not impossible. But Jerry doesn't accept that.
No, he does not.
He insists. So I took the challenge, and in my article I do consider all the reasons why it's difficult, if not impossible. And then I consider all the reasons why, in spite of difficulty, such a theology is vitally necessary. So I came up with what I call theological footholds for a theology for spiritual but not religious people. Based on the common themes and beliefs I unearthed in my extensive interviews with SBNR, spiritual but not religious people, I came up with several theological footholds, and I'll mention three tonight. One is spiritual experience. SBNRs often understand spiritual experience in terms of awe, wonder, mystery, gratitude, or perhaps a sense of cosmic consciousness and all is oneness. There are theological footholds in this quest. You can imagine such traditional concepts as the feeling of absolute dependence or ultimate concern as starting points. Although there will be no one-to-one correspondence, and there will definitely be some methodological problems, this is nevertheless a starting place. How about the second point? The second point I want to bring up tonight is the natural world. Nature and its non-human inhabitants are of special concern to SBNRs, as of course they should be to all of us. While these things are revered by SBNRs as likely sites of spiritual experience, they also link with the climate crisis, which is of concern to SBNRs as it is to all of us. So this is a natural meeting place for doing theology. It won't be that the natural world is a creation, that won't work, but it is a theological foothold that can tie in such traditional themes as responsibility, will, sin, etc. Not that we have to use those words, but the concepts may resonate. And the third foothold that I want to bring up tonight is the authentic self. SBNRs are very concerned with authenticity rather than social impositions. This foothold could be combined with the other two, and I won't get into how that would work, but by doing this, SBNRs can feel a connection with cosmic energies, which I think would help promote activism in them and help move people out beyond the personal self and its concerns, which is something of an anchor and also a hindrance for SBNRs. So the combination of theological footholds, all three, could help SBNRs be in solidarity with religious peoples as we work for the common good together. So I'm suggesting that these and other theological footholds could help SBNRs develop what they don't have yet, and this is very important. What they don't have yet, and which I believe they need, is an integrated theology. Not some kind of universalism, I'm not talking about that, but an integrated theology galvanizing, deepening, and activating their shared concerns and beliefs. Thank you.
Mark Heim, more window than wall, the comparative expansion of confessional theology.
So I believe there's a place in the project of Theology Without Walls for confessional theologies. I think that's true both from the point of view of practice of these theologies and from the confessional perspective. I think theology without walls, insofar as it's pursued and practiced, that means it reaches some kind of concreteness in terms of its decisions and understandings, becomes particular. In that sense, it becomes confessional. The fact that it doesn't conform to perhaps any existing religious traditions perspective doesn't make it less confessional. It makes it maybe more solitary. And from the other side, from the point of view of confessional traditions, there is, I think, an intrinsic drive toward universality, what the Christian tradition expresses as faith-seeking understanding, which is ultimately the desire to encompass all the data that Jerry is always encouraging us to undertake. And the fact that Theology Without Walls was, from the very beginning for Jerry, a committed quest. It wasn't an abstract philosophical exercise. It was about finding religious truth for the purpose of engaging and living in accordance with that truth. I think it makes this only more the case. So my observations are pretty simple, I think. No theology lacks walls, as no complex organism lacks a body plan, no cell lacks a membrane. A theology without walls shouldn't measure itself by how many walls it's able to subtract. I think many theologies will be distinctive and fruitful by virtue of their removal of some walls, successively and insistently and regularly. For me, comparative theology is the best example of that learning from a confessional Christian point of view, and the best example of an expanding confessional perspective. It might be considered a bilateral theology without walls, a kind of reading together of sources from two or more religious traditions, typically from one home tradition to another, and then returning. But rather than erasing an entire border between two entities, like Hinduism and Christianity, the comparative theologian has pierced one specific wall, the one separating the backyards of these two writers, these two texts, the convention that had meant the readers of one text were never readers of the other. A different work of comparative theology will lower yet one other specific wall and beat a little path of conversation back and forth across that line, and so on and so on. A theology without walls could be taken to be a theology with no inside, no shape or structure to frame it, or to order a life lived in accordance with it. But I presume all of these quests for theology without walls are lived quests, and one tries to live in accordance with it as one goes. So in truth, theologies without, as they develop, theologies without walls, whether in individual scholars or as collective endeavors, they will take on some structure, or inherit and maintain it. A comparative Christian theology is a home with plentiful windows, and new ones being constantly added. Such an expansive confessional theology is one that seeks its newer and always more universal form. It could be taken by those outside to be walled in, with no true access to the widest religious world. And critics within the confession in question will warn that the expansion constitutes drastic renovation. It threatens the load-bearing structure of the entire institution. But my hope and belief is that these cautions prove to be in the end similar to the assumptions of a pre-Gothic architecture. Assumptions that could be definitively reversed and defeated only with the actual realization of buildings that turn out to be, in fact, more window than wall. The comparative confessional theologies of that ilk, I think, have an important role to play in the Theology Without Walls discussion.
Next was supposed to be Jeffrey Long. I gather he came to San Diego, got here, and then damaged his foot in a serious way, and cannot be with us. So I'm just going to share my own little summary that I give in the book of Jeffrey's contribution. It's really in the same section called Expanded Confessional Theologies as Mark's paper. And here Jeffrey Long argues that the Vedanta tradition of Ramakrishna is already a theology without walls. The founding figures of multiple traditions, such as Jesus and Buddha, might be avatars. I failed to give you the title, let me just pause there. Hinduism Without Walls, ? Exploring the concept of the avatar interreligiously. And so at this point, Jeffrey is saying the founding figures of multiple traditions, such as Jesus and Buddha, might be avatars. Universal in its aspirations, Vedanta remains one tradition among others. It affirms universal ideas, such as a divine reality which manifests itself to human beings, but renders this idea concrete in, for example, Ramakrishna as the avatar of our current historical epoch, whose mission is to teach the harmony and ultimate unity of all religions. The aim of Vedanta is the realization of the divine in every being. According to Sri Aurobindo, the Buddha is the divine incarnation who chooses to set aside his divinity in order to show us the path to realizing our inherent divinity. Jesus, too, is regarded as divine. Perhaps the Jesus who says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, no one comes to the Father but through me, is the same I who, as Krishna, says, in whatever way living beings approach me, thus do I receive them. All paths lead to me. So that's thanks to Jeffrey Long. And Francis Clooney is supposed to be next. He said he had another commitment, hoped he could get here from that.